You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this episode of our series Let's Talk Sustainable Business, brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I'm welcoming back Geraldine Matchett, co-CEO and CFO at Royal DSM. Geraldine joined DSM's managing board in August 2014 and became co-CEO in February 2020. Geraldine holds a bachelor's degree in physical and human geography from Reading University in the UK and a master's degree in sustainable development from Cambridge University. In episode 3 of our season 1 podcast series, we talked about UN Sustainable Development Goals. Today, I would like to discuss with Geraldine how DSM has incorporated these goals into their purpose and their strategy. Welcome back, Geraldine.
Thank you.
So we learned that you are a purpose-led organization, and we had a really interesting discussion about what that means and how it's incorporated. What is the reason you have related your purpose now to the UN SDGs?
Yes, so I think what is key here is that for a long time, and you're right, we discussed a little bit our origins and how far back DSM has been a triple P, people, planet, profit company, and SDG stock. But for a long time, it was very niche. So ESG investing was, and people had their own ideas and their own themes, etc. Now, what the UN has done very well is effectively create, in my view, a language around which we can anchor certain themes and certain ambitions, and those are the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we have done when we defined our strategy is said, well, as Royal DSM, the world leading company when it comes to making food and for humans and animals nutritious, so all the micronutrients, the vitamins, the omegas, probiotic, prebiotic, all of that. What is it that we can really have an influence on? So, to be specific, we have anchored for our nutrition part of our business predominantly around 4 SDGs. So, SDG 2, zero hunger, because we are in the food space, and hunger is not only about calories, it's about malnutrition, which unfortunately in today's world, we still have about 700 million people suffering from hunger and 2 billion from malnutrition. So this is still, there's a long way to go in that zero hunger ambition. Then there's SDG 3, which is really about good health and well-being. And that is in economies where it's not about people dying of starvation, but to be fair, the health outcomes are not good. And we saw that last year in the pandemic, that poor nutrition leads to actually chronic diseases, non-communicable. The most obvious is obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues. And how does nutrition, better nutrition, lead to better outcomes? So that's SDG 3 and our contribution there. And then we have 12 and 13. 12 is a bit broader, but it's about responsible consumption and production. And this is really about the production of food. I mean, to be fair, the most impacting human activity on the physical environment is agriculture, is production of food. And that has been the case for many, many, many civilizations. And therefore, responsible production of food, which is not the case today. Today, we waste a third of the food production is food waste. That is not a responsible way of neither producing nor consuming. So there's a lot of things to be done on SDG 12 around the food systems. And last but not least, SDG 13 is climate action. So there are multiple aspects of the food systems being linked to climate change. On the one hand, it's the second biggest activity in terms of greenhouse gas footprint, agriculture. So agriculture in itself and the food production is the second biggest guilty party, I would say. And at the same time, it is the biggest victim straight away right now. Big climate events, drought, floods. In fact, it's estimated that desertification is currently forcing to relocate 40 million people a year off their land because they cannot grow anymore. So there are huge interrelationships between the food systems and climate. So what we've done is, and it doesn't mean that the other SDGs don't matter. Of course, we have SDGs around inclusion and diversity, around all the aspects. Water is a very topic, but we try to really bring down from a strategic shaping where are the areas where we can have the most impact, and those are the ones that we have identified, and then we really work on those in terms of our innovation pipeline, the work that we do with our suppliers upstream, the work that we do with our customers downstream, so that it's very much we always say you cannot be successful in a world that fails, and that means you cannot do it on your own either. So we chose the SDGs that we can work on with with the companies in our value chain to make a really meaningful impact.
Geraldine, you just said a very important sentence, and that is, we have chosen the SDGs where we can make really an impact. And I think that is a very important point. Sometimes people get a bit critical if there are too many SDGs, but I think what people have to realize is we have a common language, we have scoped out what needs doing to develop the world, and it is very important that different people focus on different things where they are capable of doing something. And I'm always getting worried when I see company web pages where all SDGs are mentioned. Then I'm saying, where are you going to focus your attention? Where are you actually going to make a difference?
Yeah, and here I think it's very important for anyone listening to understand there's two sides to it. On the one hand, you have to have a health check. You cannot cherry pick and say, we're great here, but we're making really a negative impact elsewhere. So on the whole suite of SDGs, I think you have to commit to a minimum standard of at the least, do no harm. So as a sort of, and that's where, for instance, ESG rankings are important because they look at all of the SDGs and all of the aspects, and they try to say, okay, you don't only get positive points for what you do well, but we also will look at whether you're doing harm elsewhere, because that's not great either. So on the one hand, it's important to realize everything is interconnected. But when it comes to having a real positive impact and linking it to your purpose, you have to be clear where it is that you can lead to market transformation, to system change. And that can only be in your areas of strength. So that's how it's not either or. And indeed, well, the world is a little complicated. It does take quite a few SDGs to cover all the important themes. So it's a little bit, and we see that as well in the investing world. So shareholders, on the one hand, will do a scan to make sure that there's nothing offensive in what the company is doing. So that is your qualifier with regards to your impact on SDGs. And then there's your ability to actually be extremely successful in the context of changing markets and changing systems. And that's the opportunity side. So there's the downside and the upside. And SDGs are helpful in both.
Yeah, no, and thank you for pointing that out. It's absolutely important to be clear that we're not compensating one with the other. We have to be at least neutral, but what we're aiming at is positive impact, of course. Yeah, so, but let's get a bit more concrete. So you mentioned zero hunger, and you talked about malnutrition. What something that is really very close to my heart is there are so many children still malnutritioned, and that will jeopardize their whole life. In the early days, that is a real big problem. But you are doing a number of things around zero hunger. Maybe you can share with us a couple of examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that malnutrition in the first 1,000 days of life, which includes within the mother and after birth, basically determines the neural development, particularly of children for their life. So if you don't have the right nutrition in those first 1,000 days of life, you cannot recover later. And as a result, and because we are the leading company in the world when it comes to the knowledge and the science behind micronutrients, we've been for many, many years working with development agencies and saying, be careful, when you say zero hunger, people think calories. They think people dying of energy. But in fact, that is only half the problem. Of course, it's the first one, because if you die, you die. But malnutrition and stunting is chronic in still a lot of countries for a lot of children. And that's the stunting is the outcome of a deficiency in macronutrients. So what is very hopeful, it brings a lot of hope, is that the realization that it's about malnutrition has really got embedded in the strategies of World Food Program, of UNICEF, of World Vision, of the big NGOs and UN organizations trying to help these populations that are in these really critical survival mode. And so we've been working with micronutrient supplementation of, for instance, the World Food Program has the main thing they will deliver on site is something called Super Cereal Plus, which is a porridge, which has, of course, a lot of calories, but also now is rich in micronutrients. We've looked at, so for example, we've been working with UNICEF for now many, many years on sachets of micronutrients that people can sprinkle on whatever it is that they are eating. Is it rice? Is it, whatever it is that they are able to have? If they add this, they will get the minimum requirements of micronutrients to be, to enable, and it's really focused on pregnant mothers, young mothers, and children. But there's a nicer example which goes beyond that, because that is still relying on aid agencies, which currently, by the way, is doing a fantastic job. Last year was a terrible year. We basically There was an improvement in the number of people suffering from hunger and extreme poverty every single year for 10 years. And last year we reversed and we're back 10 years back. So it's not a good picture. But in the context of a conversation actually at the World Economic Forum many years ago, there was an observation of saying, isn't it a bit frustrating that these agencies import the food into Africa to help the populations of Africa starving? And it's grain coming from Europe, from the US. Isn't there a way of producing food in Africa for Africa? And they talked to us and they said, hey, DSM, would you be interested and able to see if we can do that differently? So we actually created Africa Improved Foods, which is a very successful PPP, public-private partnership structure, where we invested in a production plant for this Super Cereal Plus in Rwanda, in Kigali. And it is a joint effort of the Development Bank of the Netherlands, FMO, of the UK, CDC, of the World Bank through IFC, and ourselves. And we, decided, well, why don't we make Super Cereal Plus in Africa for Africa? And if we fast forward now 6 years, we have a very big world-class standard production facility in Kigali that firstly employs 300 plus qualified people. So it's really created an environment to up the skills and replicable skills in the country. We source grain from 130,000 smallholder farmers in East Africa. So in Rwanda, Uganda, and that was critical for livelihoods. And we're reaching 1.6 million people with nutritious food. Now, when you calculate the impact of that, this project so far is creating $1 billion of added value for East Africa, because it's effectively ticking two boxes at the same time: development and aid. And of course, malnutrition. And these are the kind of things that we need as a world to be better at doing. It's really building the trust between the various stakeholders, including the local governments, including the farming association and cooperatives, so that you actually have an impact across the whole chain so that it is sustainable. This is something that will keep going and keep going. It doesn't need subsidies. At one point it stands on its own legs, and it's able to, you've actually transformed the system, as opposed to philanthropy or aid, which unfortunately, as we know, is like a tap. It's on or it's off, and then it's over when the tap gets closed.
Exactly. Is that something that you will be able to replicate in other parts of Africa?
Yeah, so we're looking at various. This is one, so it's the one that is the most mature now. We're now looking to replicate in different countries. So Ethiopia, Kenya, we're looking at Nigeria. So the continent, we also, in that mindset, we do egg hubs. So we're looking at how do you facilitate the emergence of small farmers who can produce eggs in a good way, because eggs are actually, from a micronutrient content, a very important source of micronutrients, particularly for school programs and for children. So
Hmm.
how do you, eggs are extremely expensive in the majority of emerging countries. It's a luxury. And yet it's a very rich source of micronutrients. So how do you create egg hubs and facilitate an entrepreneurial sort of ecosystem
Mm.
emerging around that? We're looking at working with the millers of grain, to basically fortify staple foods, to a much bigger degree than has been the case so far. So I gave you one example out of many, but this is all anchored. This is not philanthropy. This is what we are strong at in all geographies of the world. And we're challenging ourselves to make sure that we are really reaching mouths around the world and not just in more mature and wealthier economies. And it is scaling, and it's nice to see, I have to say, but it took a lot of perseverance, because the trust, unfortunately, is often not there, that the private sector genuinely means to do the right thing. And there's still a bit of distrust when it comes to getting these things going, of what's in it for you and why are you wanting to do this. And our answer is, we believe that anything that makes a lot of sense will be sustainable and is worth doing over time. But to get started, you need different stakeholders to get together and have that common mission.
Now that's very clear. I mean, you mentioned in our last episode, which fascinated me, that you turning uh, salmon fish into vegetarians. So that's another part of, in essence, also still zero hunger, isn't it?
Yes. So if you think about the situation on this planet, and this is the geographer speaking, the world population has tripled in the lifetime of my mother. So in 1950, there were 2.5 billion people on this planet. Now there's 7.8, depends which estimate you want to take, in one lifetime. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that during exactly the same period, the number of people in extreme poverty has shrunk from 70% of world population, so 70% of that 2.5 billion, to below 10% of a much bigger number. So it's shrunk in percentage terms and in absolute terms. But there is a very big but to this. This was achieved through the industrialization of food systems. It's the only way we were able to feed 3 times more people, and it has its consequences, which is the environmental impact of intensive agriculture. And we're seeing that come up all over the place. So, what we're looking at as a company is saying, how can we anticipate and help transition the food systems to something more sustainable that can still feed the existing population? And there is the estimates that we're going towards 10 billion. I would say let's see whether that happens. But nonetheless, even sustaining 8 billion people on this planet is a challenge. So we look at where are the environmental impacts of the food systems and what can we do. In the case of fish, aquaculture is seen as a good source of protein, and of omega-3s, and therefore salmon is healthy to eat. On the other hand, aquaculture uses fish oil from the oceans. So to grow one salmon, you actually have to go and fish out between 10 and 20 fish from the ocean, squeeze them, get the oil, because that's what makes the salmon rich in omega-3. Now, biotech, actually, the fish in the ocean get their omega-3 content from algae, and we have the technology to basically produce directly from the algae this very rich oil. And it's used in, by the way, infant formula for many years. It's a very trusted source of omega-3, but we found a way to do it at scale. So currently we are indeed supplying the aquaculture industry with omega-3 oil directly from the algae, which has a fisheries benefit, which is, addresses what was actually a resource um, ceiling that the industry was hitting, but it also means the salmon can have more of it because they were getting less and less, and therefore salmon was actually becoming less nutritious. So it has a health impact, and so it's good for people and it's good for planet, and it's indeed leveraging some of the science and innovation that exists in the world, but you need to scale it.
Now let's get to another SDG,
Mhm.
and let's talk about climate action. But we can, I think, bring it back to agriculture because there are these culprits, and people talk about them. Let me use the word farting, but it's actually burping that creates the methane. Now, the good news about methane, it's not as persistent in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, but the bad news, it's much more contributing to global warming. So I understand you have addressed that, but let me uh, put a little nudge here. Is there are some people who are saying we will go to another way of creating that sort of protein in the future. So maybe not solving the cow problem itself, but creating meat protein in a different way is the solution. How do you see that?
Yeah, so these are all the exciting things we like to think about. Maybe just indeed a couple of things on. So agriculture is the second biggest contributor to greenhouse gas, and within that, there's of course the use of soil and taking vegetation away and all of these issues, deforestation. But livestock is indeed a big contributor. Methane is 20 times more potent than CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's something that can be addressed actually with a lot less infrastructure requirements than a lot of other solutions. So, how did we look into this? Well, once upon a time, we did a climate-related ideation exercise, and that goes back more than 10 years. And thinking, what can we in our space of nutrition do about climate change? And indeed, we identified methane burped by particularly cows, but all ruminants. And through adding a quarter of a teaspoon of a certain feed ingredient, we can reduce the methane burped by cows by at least 30%, and in some cases up to 50, 60%. And it's just tweaking a little bit that digestive system so that it doesn't create as much methane. Now, this is going through all sorts of testing on 10,000 cows, all sorts of herds. And at first, when we started doing that, we were told, why are you doing this? Who cares about methane burnt by cows? Now, all the dairy companies have a big challenge. The spotlight is on them of the environmental footprint of the dairy herds. There's different aspects to the footprint because it impacts watersheds, etc. But the climate impact is part of the footprint of a country. And in big dairy countries like the Netherlands, where we're based, but also New Zealand is a good example, this is meaningful. And New Zealand is actually the first country in the world that has set a target to reduce, it's called enteric methane, so methane from livestock, as a national target. And we have dairy companies who are out there with explicit targets of carbon neutral milk and a low methane supply chain. It's part of their scope 3, effectively, greenhouse gases. So that's where we are today. But to your challenge, and by the way, it's going through the final hoops of registration, regulation, etc. And this will go commercial very shortly in countries like New Zealand, in the whole of the EU, with the EU Green Deal and the farm to fork strategies. That's all part and parcel of where we fit. But to your challenge of, is the world going to getting meat from a different source? So there's two topics. One is, should we go away from animal-based proteins, dairy or meat, and go to plant-based? Now, this is more the flexitarian type diet, so a transition to less animal-based, more plant-based. We are working on all of that because we're in human nutrition very strongly. So we also look at what makes human nutrition nutritious. And so we are helping companies who are developing these alternative offerings to make sure that the nutrition is there and the environmental footprint. And when it comes to more lab grown meat, whether a cell is grown as part of a sheep or cow or pig, or whether it's in a lab, it needs nutrients. And therefore, what we're looking at is actually we're scanning all of the technologies around, the impossible foods type companies, and saying there's a lot of technologies out there that are trying, but the cell still needs the same building blocks. And so we're actually looking at the nutrition within the liquid in which these cells are grown, because in effect, it's the same science. It just comes in a different shape. So it could be that if you project yourself, in 10, 20 years, that there are some technologies that are scalable, affordable, and that will provide some degree of I don't know if you can still call it animal-based protein, but um, that is, produced in a different way. But we need to also be very mindful about these topics. I mean, there are different geographies on this planet, and for some, the challenge is still malnutrition and access to enough
Yeah.
protein at a very affordable price. And this, I think, is a long way from being very affordable.
Yeah, and there is also the question of the energy bill that's attached to it. Yeah.
Indeed.
But
Hmm.
but it's something worthwhile watching, and I see that you guys having an eye on it. So that's reassuring. I must say it's impressive how you have had a long-term perspective on your R&D program, and suddenly, yeah, for some people it comes surprising. These things solve problems that some people didn't see coming, but you have already the solutions. So. Uh, Unfortunately, we have to come to an end again. It's so lovely speaking to you and listening to all the stuff that's happening in your company. Uh, but could you help people who want to transform their business, as you have done successfully? What are key things to watch to become a more sustainable business? That
Hmm.
would be very helpful.
No, absolutely. And indeed, we could keep talking for hours. This is all very exciting things and at the core of what we do. But maybe if we zoom out and take a broader picture for people who are in different areas, I think that the three things I would advise are as follows. One is it's important to redefine success. So, what does success look like? And define that in the context of market transformation. So, why will the world be a better place if you as a company are successful? And when you answer that question, you often find that you have to work with your upstream, your downstream, your suppliers, your customers, your stakeholders. So broaden the conversation in the company of what does success really look like. And then you will start identifying not only your purpose, but also what are the really important things on the three horizons. Horizon one is today, horizon two is in the foreseeable future, and then even horizon three, what is out there on the horizon that you say, oh, okay, what should we be aiming for? So that's one. Um, the other one is really about visibly embedding those ambitions. We call them triple P, so people, planet, profits, both internally, wherever you can, whether it be through your system of incentives, not because people are driven by money per se, but it's a very strong signal of what the company feels really matters, but also through external commitments. So have the courage to go out there and put some bold ambitions of how you want to have an impact as an organization. Um, and I think that the third one we touched upon today already is focus on the areas where you truly matter to the world. So it's important to do a health check that on your SDGs you don't do any harm, that at least you're neutral, preferably you're positive on all, but at least do no harm. But really do the exercise of identifying which ones can you have a meaningful contribution, and then really focus on those internally and with the stakeholders, not only private sector but also public sector and NGOs, and say, okay, how do we work together to move that? So I would say be courageous, um, And what you will be rewarded by is you will become a talent magnet. People love to not only have successful careers, but if they can add to that, have a positive impact. Everybody loves that. I haven't come across one person who says I don't care. So it's worth it. And sometimes you will fail. Sometimes you will trip over. Not everything will work. Innovation is always a risky thing to do, because you have to try things out. So then it's all about the usual sort of the number of experiments you can take in terms of capital allocation. But I think if you anchor it around defining success, visibly showing what you're aiming for, and being very focused in those areas, you'll be on a good track.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was very enjoyable listening to you and your experiences and giving that advice. So thank you, Geraldine, and thank you to the audience. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcast. And you can also write to us and give us feedback at sustainability@tcb.org. And thank you for listening today, and please join us again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.